Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, what I want to do is it possible I could borrow a book from somebody? Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I shall return this book to you at the end. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about how the writing of this novel came about, and some of the things that I tried to do to achieve what became this book. When the first book came out, a long way gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, which was a memoir about my experiences in the war in Sierra Leone, I was on the road quite a lot, traveling and speaking about it. And then I began to observe the way the world was looking at a place like Sierra Leone and other places that are recovering from war. And some of these observations led to some conclusions. And one of them, the particular, was that how very quickly the attention, whether it's media or even just people's interest in certain places, can change as soon as the bloodshed ends and the guns silenced. People go to the next hot spot, as they will call it. And that becomes what's in the news. But nobody really pays attention. How do people go back home? How do they begin to learn to live in the place that had once been their homes again? Can they go back to the way their lives had been? If not, what do they do? And so I began to ask these questions. And so I went back home to Sierra Leone, my own country, quite a lot and experienced that return myself, along with my fellow citizens who were trying to go back to their towns, villages, their homes, and their cemeteries or where their ancestors are buried, and try to reconnect to a place that has now sort of had two different meanings for them. There's before the war and during the war. And the third one was now after the war, coming back, trying to learn how to live with those two connotations that you have of this place. And so I began to observe these things, and that's really what began to bring about within me a lot of questions. Why do people go back, first of all, after a devastation in their country or in their homes? Of course, it's their home, so this is where their spirit rests, but people come back with different nostalgia. People come back because they think they can go back to the way things have been. Others come back because they've been told story of this landscape, that they haven't really experienced the war. Because at the end of the war, the population is different. There are people who were born towards the end of the war who do not really have any recollection of what the war had been. So all they've been told by their grandparents or maybe by their parents are the good stories of this land. And so they come back with that nostalgia. There are other people who are coming, they're quite afraid of this place, but they're hoping to have a different form of life, not the way through the traditional ways through which they had lived. So all of these things, this narrative starts first with an elder, an older woman called Mama Kadi, who begins to walk back on the path going to a place called Imperi. Now, I deliberately did this and tried to imagine what it would have felt like for my grandmother to return. So I wrote this character thinking about that. But also following the oral tradition, which is what I grew up in the idea that when people are sort of taken away from their land, the reconnection to that land has to be done by the elders first. They are the first who would sort of rekindle their broken friendship with the land. So she starts to walk back, and even when wars end, or when wars are going on, when people are killed and gunned down, nobody is going anywhere trying to bury them. People run for their lives. So when you return home, you have to even start with that task of cleaning those bones, making the place livable again. You have to even cut the trees and the grasses that have grown in the houses, because human beings are no longer living there. So the grasses and the trees find it as a permission to actually come and begin to grow. When people come and their spirits filled towns and villages, the trees and the grasses will retreat back. So you begin to see all of that. And of course, people who come into these places are of different characteristics. You have former child soldiers who are returning. You have an amputated man who returned, who has two children who had been amputated during the war. And the young man who had amputated them followed them to try to find a way to make peace with them. You also have a young woman who is returning who had had a child during the war, and that child reminds her of what had happened. Then you have a family, sort of the central character of the narrative, a young fellow called Bokari, who comes back with his family and finds his father in this village again. And this family consists of children who come from different times of the war. So they all have different reasons why they've returned. And various other people come into town, and so the school starts, and this town starts to thrive again. As it's thriving, there are other challenges that it faces, and you begin to see how people deal with those challenges in the wake of the war. Now, another thing that's very important is that how do you preserve what means the most to you in this uncertain time of your life? How do you move towards the future when this past is very new and is trying to pull at you? How do you even learn to see this landscape differently? For example, before the war, if you saw a young boy on a path with a machete, the only image that came to mind, first of all, you did not fear anything. You encountered them, you said hello, and you walked past them because you only thought they were going to the farm to either brush the farm or to harvest some crops. But after the war, there was another meaning added to this. When you saw a boy with a machete and you encountered them on the path, you flinched a little bit because you remembered what had happened during the war when people had machetes and what they did with it. So how do you learn to trust in the humanity of that place again, in the people that you encounter? Before the war as well, when you greeted people, greetings were very elaborate. You would ask people, how are you? How is your grandfather? How is your grandmother? How is your grandchild? And they would give you detailed descriptions about how everybody was doing. And in return, you would have the same pleasure to do the same thing. Now, after the war, you could not do that, because by asking a question, you did not know who someone had lost. You will be actually opening the wound that they may have been trying to heal for quite some time. So all of these hesitations are in the air when people return. Now, in order for me to do all of these things, there's a language issue that was there, because first of all, the older people are trying to bring back the tradition that is what they know, and also is because those are the times when things had been peaceful. So they're trying to bring back people to the idea of oral tradition, of storytelling, because we think of story as medicine. So they're trying to infuse that medicine into people again to strengthen them with the knowledge and wisdom of their ancestors. But it's difficult now because during the war, the dynamics of respect between adults and children had changed. During the war, children were forced to inflict violence on their own communities. And through that, they really came to get a rare sense of power, in the sense that they had weapons, they could determine who lived or died. So when they return now as former young commanders, can they really be under the tutelage of the elders again? And if not, how do the elders find a way to bring them to understand their role as children with all these experiences that they've had that have sort of given them a lot of things that are not very childlike any longer? How do they begin to function in that capacity again? So there's that difficulty with trying to recreate that tradition. Also, during the war, everybody, when people flee, they go to different parts of the country and sometimes out of the country. So they're exposed to different realities, and they come back now having newer sort of thinking about how they want their lives to be. Is it really possible in this new landscape that they are coming in? So all these questions are asked in this narrative, and you begin to see these characters. But when the older people speak, they speak in a language that is much older, that is filled with parables and adages and things like that. And when the younger people speak, even though the language is very beautiful and figurative, they speak less like that. So in this narrative, you see also that play of language. And I'll give a few examples to that. When I'm writing about my country or about any place on the African continent, there's always a struggle for me as a challenge, but I always come out satisfied, which is trying to find the English equivalent of some of the things that I want to say. Some of the things that I've imagined or that I've observed that did not necessarily occur in English. And I try to find the English equivalent to actually set the mood. I'm also a writer who believes that language has to fit landscape. I would never say adults in Sierra Leone referring to children as you guys. That would not be what they would say. They would say children, say boys or girls. So I'm very aware of those small intricacies, but also when I'm trying to find the English equivalent of things that I'm saying, being that Sierra Leone has a lot of languages, I grew up speaking about 7 of them, and one of them, my mother tongue in particular, Mende, is very figurative, and it's filled with a lot of images in the way things are said. So if you say in Mende, for example, that you are upset the translation, it means